So this is basically a particular section within my web application courses, and the topic of this section is how web applications work. Because I think you can't be talking about building web application if you don't understand the big picture of how web applications work. So in this particular section, I've just taken the time to kind of like explain how web applications work generally. So if you understand the general principles of web application, then you'll be able to follow through. If I'm building ASP.NET Core web application, you'll be able to understand what I'm doing. If I'm doing Node.js web application, you'll be able to understand what I'm doing. If I'm doing like Django web application, you'll be able to understand what I'm doing. If I'm doing Laravel, you'll be able to understand what I'm doing, because every web server based web application, every server-based web application follow the same principle. So what I try to do in this section is I just felt it would be a good idea to just explain how web applications work generally. So that's what I've decided to do in this particular section. I covered so many topics. I covered the three components of web application, which is like data communication pattern, the data storage, and data presentation. That is the main component. And then this basically, I just decided to put a pictorial diagram of how web applications work generally. So let me just explain how web applications work generally. So basically, this is basically how web applications work. You have the key component, you have the user, you have the browser. The browser is the browser like your Google Chrome, your Edge, and whatever in your computer. Then you have the web server. Your web server could be like Amazon Web Services, the server we have an Amazon Web Service or GoDaddy or Azure or whatever. And then your web applications are always hosted in your web server. So your web application might have a database and a collection of HTML template or static files. So this is how it works. The user wants to talk to Amazon.com. Then what you do is that you type Amazon on your browser. Then your browser will send the message to the web server. Then your web server will send the message to your web applications. Then if your web application, what the web application will do is that it will fetch any appropriate data that is appropriate to that request and generate the HTML pages that are appropriate to that request and map them together. So the stuff that maps these two together is what we call the templating engine. So your templating engine is a core component of your web application. It maps this together and then return it return it to the web application. The web application will create a response and pass the response to the web server. The web server will now pass the response as a full HTML page to the browser, and the browser will display the HTML page to you as the user. So this is the big picture of how web applications work. The idea is that if you understand this, you should be able to follow through. If I'm building like ASP.NET Core, you should be able to understand what I'm doing. If I'm building like Django, you should be able to understand what I'm doing. If I'm building like Laravel, you should be able to understand what I'm doing, because all of them follow the same principle, the same pattern. So I kind of like abstracted away the general principle that I'm explaining here. So I covered a couple of stuff here, key concepts and all this stuff here, main actors and, the rule of engagement, HTTP. HTTP basically is the communication protocol between your browser and your web server. So we have resources, URL, and routers. That is basically your URL is the address of a specific resources you are requesting for. Then these are basically like your router that maps an address to a particular resources. So I think so the communication is between the browser and the client and the browser usually follows a response pattern. So you send a request to the web server. The web server will generally return a response. So that's basically, it's straightforward. So I talked about this request handler. So, and request handler is more or less like a framework specific class object that implements methods. So what the method does is to accept request, HTTP request, process that request, and then return a response. Like in this case, I have my template. This is the template HTML snippet, and this is the data for this template. So what the request handler method does is to get the data from the database and specify the template to use and the data for that template. So it is the duty of the templating engine. It is the duty of the templating engine now to kind of like map these two together and generate a clean, pure HTML that will be sent to the browser. Your browser does not understand your browser does not understand the data in your template. This is a template that an ASP.NET Core result template. As you can see, we have the data and the HTML snippet. So it is the job of your templating engine to evaluate all these if statement for each statement, else statement, and generate the appropriate HTML. So your browser will not understand all this for each and all the rest. So it is your templating engine that has the responsibility to evaluate all this and generate a clean, pure HTML only file that will be sent to the browser. The browser only understands JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. So anything you are going to be sending from your web server should only contain HTML, CSS, and your JavaScript. And it is the job of the templating engine to create those particular specific files. So this is basically what your templating engine does. It takes the template and the data and creates a clean, pure HTML with the HTML and any dynamic data that you've specified on this template within the HTML page. This is the page that will be sent to the browser. I think that's what I covered in this particular section. It's a very nice section within the course, Web Application Courses. So if you buy the course, you'll be able to see everything, and and this will kind of like prepare you to assimilate subsequent discussions on framework specific applications. So if I start working on Laravel, you should straight away understand what I'm doing, because everything follows this pattern. If I'm talking about ASP.NET Core, you should be able to understand this straight away, because everything follows the same pattern. So that's basically what I covered in this particular section. Thank you very much, and then bye.